Hello, everybody. Welcome to the White Bear Lake Area Historical Society's presentation tonight. The Plantation Night Club, White Bear's Gangster Hangout, Gangster headquarters. So ultimately, tonight is made possible through a partnership with the Ramsey County Library System. So thank you, Ramsey County Libraries. It is funded in part through the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment, which provides all kinds of wonderful programming through the library system and many other places and opportunities, including things that those other programs we do. And then, of course, we don't want to forget our wonderful members of the White Bear Lake Area Historical Society, because without our members, we would not be here. So thank you all for being a part of this one way or another. And we'll go ahead and jump right into the programming itself. So one of the interesting things for me, as a historian, I'm Sarah Hansen, the executive director of the White Bear Lake Area Historical Society, and I have actually been here since 2001, serving as executive director. So a lot of the stories I feel like I know fairly well, and the plantation is one of those that is a fairly common one when we talk about quite a bit in various bits and pieces, and I thought I had a pretty good handle on it, and I think I do, but in researching for this program and putting things together for this presentation, we found all sorts of wonderful treasures, not necessarily specifically on the plantation, but all kinds of tangents that led to the plantation. And it'll be an interesting ride as we go. So I guess that's just one more reminder for us that historical research doesn't always take you where you think it's going to. And that's part of why it's fun. So the area that was actually where the plantation ended up being constructed eventually was right in this area here, if you can see. At the very bottom of the screen, cut off from the screen, is where Highway 61 runs, if you can imagine. On the right side is Goose Lake, and on the left over here is White Bear Lake. So the former Johnson Boat Works is down here, and just kind of gives you White Bear Avenue. It would eventually come through here. So just to give you kind of a sense of where we're at. So ultimately, this land, including what was the plantation and a big chunk of what is today the White Bear Shopping Center and Kowalski's in that area, actually was originally granted to Villeroy Barnum in 1855 as part of a military land grant for a small cabin that he took, that took Villeroy and his wife Nancy away from the hustle and bustle of the city. They wanted to get out to the country, if you will. And it doesn't look much like it here in the 1950 photo, but that is exactly what that did, at least to start with. The land changed hands in 1857 when it transferred to John Lamb, who purchased it. Interestingly, it was on this site, roughly where the plantation would eventually sit, that White Bear Township was first organized in 1858. Ultimately, Lamb defaulted on his purchase and it reverted back to Barnum. And so they did retain it for a little bit longer. And then in comes Colonel Leip, William Leip, who bought Barnum's original hotel, which you can sort of see here, which was roughly about 10 rooms at the time, and he turned it into a 103-room resort, believe it or not. Built all out along the lakeshore, along where the shopping center is today, and all the way through that whole area. So really expanded the property extensively. That was one of the hints of hospitality happening around the lake. And of course, White Bear was known as Minnesota's first resort town. So we had plenty of that going on. But Leip was one of the big guys. And actually, until I dug into the research for this program, I thought he was the big guy around. And so it'll be an interesting development as we go. You'll explain why I'm a little bit perplexed by that whole thought. Here we see the Amundsen Boat Works. There were many boat builders, small boat builders in our area around the lake in those early years, the 1880s, 1870s even, and on as the years went on. But the first of the big ones, if you will, was Amundsen. He was the first on the scene, and he came to town in 1887. He lived across the tracks to the west and eventually established his operation on the shore approximately where Admiral Deas sits today. The Amundsen family operated on that site into the 1950s, and then the property was sold and eventually became the White Bear Boatyard, or the White Bear Lake Boatyard, as you see here, which was owned by Fletcher Driscoll. In 1968, the boatyard closed, and here you see in 1971 the building being demolished. Interestingly, it was Gus Amundsen, who you see on the right here, who brought John Johnson of Johnson Boat Works to White Bear. They knew each other back in Norway. And Amundsen had gone back to Norway for a visit and some celebrations and things, and ran into Johnson and said, basically, if you can get to White Bear Lake, if you can come to America and you can get to White Bear Lake, I'll give you a job. So he did. Johnson, just a few years later, arrived at Gus's house here in White Bear, and he did give him a job. And then ultimately, by 1896, Johnson was operating his own boatworks. He was incredibly ambitious and took off operating his own boatworks, which would grow and grow and grow over the past century. Here you see it about 1940. And then, of course, about 1985, all of this, basically everything in this picture, with the exception of the far right there with the VFW building, belonged to Johnson Boatworks. Everything from the loft to the boat storage and all of the boat building areas and storage areas and the docks and all of that were part of the Johnson Boatworks, as you can imagine. And that original building was tucked right in here. So quite a legacy they left. And really, they were there for more than a century. So from 1896 to 1998, the operation was continuing and building boats. In 1998 was when they actually sold to Melgis Boatworks of Wisconsin, and then ultimately the property sold to the city of White Bear Lake. Melgis got the business. So the story of the plantation actually begins with the Romeli Boatworks, the third of the big dogs in this particular Boatworks Bay, or Commercial Bay as it's officially called. We like to call it Boatworks Bay for obvious reasons. And you can see here, they were all in close proximity to each other. So on the right, we have the Romeli Boatworks over in what is today Lions Park, the Amundsen Boatworks just on the edge of Lions Park, and then the Johnson Boatworks not far from the VFW, which sits here today. And then take note of the Romeli's pavilion on the far left side that ties in as well. So it was 1895 when the Romeli Boat Company opened initially on the far shore, like I showed you, and then it actually expanded by 1899. But really, the family's story goes back much further than that. It starts in many ways with in hospitality anyway, with the St. Paul and Duluth Railway's Lakeshore Refreshment Pavilion, which is what you see here. This structure was built in 1879 by the railroad, and John D. Romeli became the manager of it, basically, in 1879. And he worked to have musical entertainment there. People would come out and dance and listen to the orchestras. And of course, they had, as you can see on the right-hand side, a little bit fishing boats and sailing boats and all kinds of other good things. And of course, refreshments as well. So ultimately, I always thought that was, he just did that and then went on to jump into some other things down the road. But really, it was almost immediate. In 1879, the railroad had built this particular spot. And by 1883, Romeli himself had jumped in and built, expanded that, basically. He enclosed a portion of it, added on to it. You can see this article from the St. Paul Globe says the Great Western Band concerts at White Bear that were inaugurated 4 years ago, so in 1879, on every Wednesday evening will be renewed, commencing on the 4th of July. Typically the season, well, people came out to the resorts in early May usually. They didn't actually, the weather was still cool. It wasn't the season, if you will, really kicked off around the 4th of July. So a lot of things don't start happening until around the 4th. But you can see as it goes further down, JD Romeli has made extensive preparations for the accommodation of visitors. He's erected a large and convenient pavilion and has made many improvements for the benefit of guests, and the concerts will be given this season with a liberality of style that will far surpass every previous season. Something you'll notice as we go is that the Romeli family liked to hard sell or hard promote certain things. And so they did that heavily. Things were always the grandest, the biggest, the most amazing. So interestingly, about that same time in 1883, Romeli had his eye on some other things. He had actually purchased this large section over here that was the Weber family farm. over on the west side of the tracks, and started platting it, had it platted for Romeli's Park. He ended up having, and this actually included the area where the lakeshore is, where the pavilions and things are, the refreshment pavilions. The St. Paul Globe of July 1st, 1883 reported that this was the largest suburban sale of real estate in a long time. Took place yesterday when J.D. Romeli, the well-known caterer, bought the Weber farm of 158 acres at White Bear Lake for $30,000. This farm is admirably broken by the location upon either side of the railroad tracks at Cottage Park Station. Mr. Romeli will immediately throw the property open for summer resort purposes. So all of it was coming together. That was how he ended up with the pavilion and started to develop it as things went on. As he laid it out, he chose to name several of the streets. He actually honored the Webers. You can see up here with Weber Avenue, that's where that comes from. But Florence, Eugene, and Clarence were the Romeli's three sons. And yes, Florence is a male, Florence Wood Romeli. And then, of course, Romeli Avenue itself. Park is fairly self-explanatory, and then Hinckley was the name of one of the other property owners to the south. So they incorporated that into the story of the community as they platted it out. Interestingly, by all accounts, at least promoted in the newspapers and other places, the sale or the project was very successful. You can see here they had 560 lots for sale in Romeli's Park. They ended up offering them up at $100 a piece, the first 200 at $100 a piece. And then you can see over here, they boast that they're the cheapest and best cottages at White Bear Lake. So they had someone promoting nonstop. At that same time, they were adding all sorts of reasons for people to come to town. So you see, again, the 4th of July was always a big deal. They're referring to the pavilion, the space, as Romeli's New Grove Pavilion at Cottage Park Station. I find it interesting that they are calling out a roller skating rink in full blast at Romeli's Dancing Parlors, which was open from 4 to 10. And then interestingly, they of course have the concerts and the hops, as they're calling them. Typically, they have special trains coming in and out of the city and all sorts of things, which is great and fairly typical during that time period of the resorts. But I was fascinated by the fact that they talk about a new hotel project as early as 1883. The fabulous Romeli Pavilion was constructed in 1890, but the fact that they started talking about it as early as 1883 is kind of striking to me. Also at that very same time, JD and Sarah Romeli completed the construction of their grand home, which was just across the tracks from the pavilion, aptly named Lakeshore, or Lakeview. I'm sorry, Lakeshore was where they were. Lakeview is what they were looking at. Interestingly, it looks fairly similar. Today it is the structure you see on the right here. It served until about a decade ago as the Havner Funeral Home and has been a private residence all the way through that time. One of my favorite sort of local trivia pieces is that this back part of the house is no longer attached like this. It was actually taken off after the Romelis sold the house, or after they decided they didn't need it as much anyway. And they actually moved it to the corner, or had it moved to the corner of 4th and Banning, and it is the site up until about a week ago of Sherburne Jewelers. So it's kind of a fun piece. That structure has been around for a very long time. Romeli continued all the way through the 1880s, boldly promoting the success and constantly promoting the value of the Romeli Park development, Romeli Park project. Ultimately, you can see here on the left, it talks about it being an unparalleled sale, a phenomenal success. This is where they sold the 200 lots at $100 a piece. I find it entertaining on the other side that he is referring to White Bear Lake as the Alpha and Omega of St. Paul. Again, unsurpassed for health, pure embracing air, boating, fishing, and accessibility. Hundreds it should be of mechanics will be needed this spring to complete the many improvements on hand. So they continuously are selling and promoting nonstop. So, and things were going so well that ultimately they ended up doing something similar in Northfield to the south of us, and Hazel Park in St. Paul, the Hazel Park neighborhood in St. Paul. So same idea, just continuing on to grab multiple spots and multiple developments. One of his changes, if you will, as time went on is different advertising techniques. And I found it interesting that he did a heavy campaign in 1889 for in the Der Wanderer, which is a German language newspaper in St. Paul, or St. Paul and Minneapolis, actually, and ultimately did a hard push through there as well. So by 1890, Romeli's new hotel that he'd been anticipating for years was finally ready to open. You can see here on May 28th, they push for carpenters. They wanted 10 experienced carpenters to come in and house painters to be able to do some of the finishing work that they needed done ultimately, which is kind of awesome. They expected to be open fairly quickly, promoting that they were sending out thousands of invitations and things. Things didn't go quite as quickly as they planned, as usually happens with construction. But ultimately, the place was ready to open in the summer, almost, because the initial grand opening date that they had promoted and sent out the invitations for had to be postponed due to issues with the electrical system. Interestingly, they postponed about 2 weeks and were able to pull it off fairly quickly and make sure that they took advantage of the season. One of the things that I have known for years about Romeli's Pavilion, and it's such a grand building that you see here, but have known is that J.D. Romeli knew the concept of location. So, for example, you can see on the left here in the foreground of the photo, the Lakeshore train station is actually right there, which is why that the railroad built their Lakeshore Refreshment Pavilion on the site of the original Romeli Pavilion spot, or the smaller Romeli Pavilion. And ultimately, it's always hit me that no matter where you were going at the lake, when you came to town, if you came to town on the train, you hit the Lakeshore station first. So Romeli had you one way or another. You could go into the pavilion and have a lunch. You could go in and book a room for the night or the week or whatever. You could hop on one of his steamers, which we'll talk about in a moment, and head to the other side of the lake. Or you could just stay and enjoy a show in their big auditorium. Whatever it was, he had something for you. Little did I realize, he also had homes to sell you and all sorts of other, or lots at least, and all sorts of other spaces to be able to entertain you and keep you here. So it was a huge coordinated effort to keep folks in the area and keep it interesting. So this is the lake side of the pavilion. You can see it's just as grand from that direction. These porches always fascinate me. I'm sure it was a wonderful balcony area to enjoy dinner or a drink or whatever, but a fun place to be for sure. And then, as I mentioned, they had their own steamers. Ultimately, the Romelis were into a little bit of everything. So initially, when Mr. Romeli purchased the property, although the full property, they referred to him as a caterer, and he was in St. Paul for many years. His wife Sarah actually continued that business as well, and they became well known for decades as sort of major caterers in the St. Paul area. Had a huge bakery and all sorts of things, and their son Florence actually continued that business on for many, many years as time went on. But ultimately, their son John Eugene Romeli, J.E. Romeli, who was typically known as Gene, really was interested more on the hospitality side and the water, the boat building and that sort of thing. He was the youngest of the three boys who were their children, and was really the one who carried out the sort of business at the lake, or continued that on, and spearheaded the boat building piece of it more so than anything, I think. Ultimately, Romeli's is credited with building the steamer White Bear. And he said, actually, it is said that J.E. Romeli was the captain of the steamer around 1900 or so. So probably around this time, that could very well be him up in the pilot house there on the boat. The census data for years shows also that JE was involved in boat building one way or another as time went on. So, and interestingly, as the years go by, you'll notice that ads for the Romeli Pavilion, Romeli Park Edition, and or Romeli Park Flat, and all of those things reference Romeli and Son, and that would absolutely be Gene Romeli. So, John D. died. It's a little bit tough to make out on the stones here, but John D. died in 1919, and his wife Sarah died in 1927. As I mentioned, Gene went on with the boating and sort of the lakefront business. Florence went on with the catering and hospitality industry in St. Paul more so. And Clarence, unfortunately, sadly died as a young boy, so was not part of the later entities. But things started to shift. J.D. Romeli was definitely the promoter, definitely the one with the big plans and that sort of thing. But ultimately, J.E., the son, Gene, had a different vision for the hospitality at the lake. So the Romeli Pavilion had sort of blossomed and grown, and they had this whole giant enterprise going on the lakeshore as part of the resort era and that sort of thing. And as that came to slowly end, the pavilion went away and other things shifted a bit. Romeli Park was built out, and ultimately the focus really shifted to the property where they had the boatworks, which is what you see here. So if you can see, we'll zoom out in a second here, but this is on the edge where Goose Lake is and White Bear Lake, where it narrows between the two. Kowalski's would be just to the south here. And you can see that lots 4 through 10 of block 1 of the Cottage Park Edition were the site of the Romeli Pavilion, or I'm sorry, the Romeli originally the Romeli Boatworks. So ultimately, Gene was kind of brilliant. I don't think it came out to be exactly what he wanted over the years, but I think he was kind of brilliant from a timing standpoint, because the boat building, the other two boatworks were still going strong at the lake, Amundsen and Johnson, and the boat building world was slowing down a little bit in some ways. And so he moved his boatworks to Minnetonka, moved it out to the west side, and turned the original boatworks, Romeli Boatworks building, into a nightclub, into a dance hall, and all sorts of fun things that go with that. Now, if you keep in mind the timing, this is Prohibition. By the mid-1920s, and 1925 was when he moved the boatworks out of there. This is the mid-1920s. Prohibition had been going on for 5 or 6 years. And ultimately, when Prohibition was first implemented, the law stated that you could not distill, you could not transfer, you could not purchase or sell alcohol. But if you had it, you could drink it legally. So ultimately, when Prohibition first was announced in January of 1919, it was set for an effective date of January 1920. So people had a year to stock up and be ready. And they did. So people who wanted to have alcohol made sure that they had it on hand. Most didn't think that Prohibition would last the 13 years that it did, but it did. And ultimately, as time went on, people ran out of their supplies. So they needed places, dance halls and other places that started to pop up in different spots. And really, they were not allowed to sell alcohol, but of course, some did. I don't know for sure that the Plantation did. I can't say for certain, but I would be shocked, I guess, if they didn't. But who knows? We do know that they were gambling and doing other things that they weren't supposed to, which you'll hear about as we go. But ultimately, they realized that they had a good thing here. So they tested it out in just the plain old building in 1925, and then decided to really invest in this concept. So ultimately, they tore down the old Boatworks building after 1925 and constructed what they first called the Romeli Winter Garden. And the White Bear Press has a great description of it. According to them, it was a fairy-like stucco structure in Spanish style, adorned with flags and a blaze of light outside, and inside containing a spacious dancing pavilion, the fruition of a beautiful dream in which nothing, even to the smallest detail, has been forgotten or overlooked. The terracotta color scheme is heightened by myriads of colored lights, baskets of flowers along the wall, and the graceful hanging chandeliers, while the slightly arched ceiling suggests the grand salon of a gigantic Atlantic liner. The popular Land of Lakes Orchestra from Wildwood discourses sweet music from an aerial platform accompanied by beautiful electric lighting effects. The spacious dancing floor is now as smooth as the first coat of glare ice that forms annually on the lake about Thanksgiving Day. Interestingly, they went through a few fits and starts in these early years. So in 1926 and most of 1927, it was known as Romeli's Winter Garden. For a very short time at the end of 1927, it was actually known as the New Pershing Inn. And they brought in, with the New Pershing Inn, they clearly had an interest in chicken suppers. They also brought in bands from Chicago and other places, well-known bands, full bands and orchestras. I find it interesting that they they advertised anyway, that they were open until 3 a.m., which seems kind of crazy, intense for that time period, but I suppose it was the Roaring 20s. And then ultimately, for their New Year's Eve party, they had continuous entertainment to 5 a.m. So people were definitely ready to come out and enjoy. We don't know exactly what happened to the New Pershing Inn, but ultimately, Mr. Mendelson from Minneapolis, who was the manager, must not have wanted to continue on, because by early 1928, things were back to the Romeli family. And it was now the White Bear Castle, which it was going by the White Bear Castle. These are a variety of ads from 1928 and 29 in the White Bear Press. You can see that they're referencing occasionally the formerly Romeli's Winter. They didn't fit the garden in there, apparently. I personally love Mel and his Harmony Bears of the White Bear Motor Sales, so I'm not sure that they're really the White Bear Motor Sales company in downtown here that are performing, but they could be, so you never know. Interestingly, the club was being managed in 1928 by Larry Johnson, who at other times had the Beach Tavern. Many people remember him from that, and from the Sandbar and the liquor store in town and some other endeavors. And then, as you can see on the far right there, one of the managers is Charles Breen, or C.O. Breen, who actually had a miniature golf entity a couple of years later, right in downtown White Bear, where ultimately the Ben Franklin would be built, and today is Good Things store. So kind of a fun piece, if you can imagine. So the big transition, or the best known phase, if you will, of the building is opened on July 2nd, 1930, just in time for the 4th of July. It was newly remodeled and renamed the Plantation Night Club, and you can see the big sign on the top. That sign actually was all lighted, and you could actually see one of the things that we were speculating as we were looking at these photos is the fact that that sign is so high and so big, and I'm sure it was incredibly prominent in the distance. And if you think about it, it was meant to be seen across Goose Lake at along Highway 61, either from the trains coming by adjacent to the tracks or adjacent to the highway, or from motorists on the highway. A lot of the directions, a lot of the ads say things like, just get to 61 and head north, and you will see it. So by 1930, when it opened this way, it was actually under the direct management of Ben Harris, who becomes an interesting part of the story as time goes on. The improvements at the site largely took place on the inside. You can see here the extensive decor. Again, the White Bear Press captured a wonderful description saying that beautiful trees spread their branches, forming a canopy, creating a bower of foliage. The check room is a splendid replica of an old shed in one corner of the plantation. KSTP radio was even connected with music broadcasts for half an hour each evening, 5 nights a week. So it was quite an endeavor. Ben Harris managed the club in its heyday from 1930 to 33, and it was during that time that the plantation was known as White Bear's Gangster headquarters. The main reason, this is not Ben Harris, I don't want to intimate that, but the main reason that the plantation, or that White Bear, was even on the radar of the Gangsters, it really stems back to John O'Connor, who you see on the left-hand side there. O'Connor was the police chief in St. Paul for many years. He predated the Gangsters by far, but he set the whole system in motion, something called O'Connor's layover agreement, where in a nutshell, the gangsters or the criminals could come to St. Paul and they would be safe. White Bear or St. Paul became a haven for gangsters, particularly during this time period. But O'Connor was strongly advocating that gangsters could come to St. Paul and essentially have protection as long as they behaved while they were here. So they ultimately came to St. Paul and did a couple of things. They had to check in at the police station, let the police know they were in town, and promise not to commit crimes while they were here. So O'Connor is finished. He moves on to other things, retirement and other things. And ultimately new police chiefs come in, new law enforcement comes in, and this whole system is already established. And it was very public. It was very well known in the sense that O'Connor actually published it in his annual reports because it brought the crime totals down. And so he was very proud of it. Of course, those around him, the communities around him, did not love it because the gangsters or the criminals would run off and do things in other towns and then make their way back to St. Paul and be safe. And ultimately, those rules did not extend to White Bear as far as the protection piece goes. But of course, we aren't that far. And so people, if they wanted to be out at the lake or be out a little bit further, they made their way out to White Bear and Bald Eagle and other places. So eventually it did impact us, especially when you have ads that say things like the Plantation Night Club, the finest and coolest ballroom in the Northwest. So interestingly, it is Ben Harris that actually brought these stories to our attention, really. One of the things that I've had the pleasure, and I mean that seriously, the pleasure of doing over the decades is go through and read all of the town board minutes from the 1880s that we have available up until the 1960s. And interestingly, during this time period, one of the things that jumped out to me was that they were issuing dance hall permits and cigarette permits and soft drink licenses and permits. And so here we see the town board minutes from May 2nd, 1932. It shows that dance permits accompanied by their $20 fee were granted to the following, and you can see there's a list, but ultimately the one that intrigued me was Ben Harris of the Plantation. Ben Harris was a known gang associate. So when we were able to truly document that he was here in White Bear, that got kind of interesting. He shows up year after year in those early few years, applying for those same permits. And so we have actual evidence that he was here. Our most notable and active gangsters in this area were Elvin Karpus, Creepy Karpus on the left there, Kate Ma Barker on the far right, and then her sons, Fred and Doc, in the middle. Ma had a couple of other sons as well, but by the time they were out here, hanging out here, those guys were off doing other things. Interestingly, this group stayed at a cottage along with some others in Delwood in 1932 and another in Bald Eagle in 1933. I don't know for certain. We don't have actual testimony or evidence that for sure that they were at the plantation, but it's very likely that at least the guys were at different points. Typically, the plantation was the place where you would come in, check in, see who else was in town, what was going on, if any big jobs were being planned, if people needed help, if you had a job being planned and needed others to help you with it, that was the place to go. And so it was where everybody sort of congregated and left messages and made their way through. So it is very likely, and again, I think Karpus and Doc probably were there more than likely. But one that we do know, or we have at least stories of, having been at the plantation, was Frank Jelly Nash, who you see here in his mugshots. And keep in mind that the majority of the pictures we have of the gangsters, if you haven't heard any of our gangster programs in the past, I usually give this caveat, but the majority of the pictures that we have of the gangsters are mugshots. They didn't tend to leave a lot of records or photographs or evidence of where they were or what was going on for obvious reasons. So we have limited records in that regard. But Jelly was said to have certainly liked the plantation. He was a member of the Barker Karpus gang for a while. And one evening in 1931, he reported hanging out at the plantation and winning $6,000 while he was gambling. So not a bad stop for him. It's also very likely that Machine Gun Kelly, who you see here again in a mugshot and was part of the Barker Karpus group, also made his way through the neighborhood at one point or another. He was renting an apartment in what are often known as the flats, or were often called the flats, which is ironically, where the Romeli's Pavilion had originally stood. So today, this is the site of the Veterans Memorial Fishing Pier, right by the VFW, which you see here. Highway 61, of course, running along here. But ultimately, this was where the Romeli Pavilion had been earlier. And keep in mind that the highway would not have been here, so it would have had a lot more space than it does now. But at one point, we have a great oral history from a lady named Burr Nash, who lived with her husband in these apartments. There were 6 different apartments, 6 different units in there. And she lived with her husband in these apartments and realized, much to her dismay, one day that the gentleman neighbor from one of the apartments that her husband took out fishing was Machine Gun Kelly. So that's part of another program, but kind of a fun one to point out. So this is a 1932 aerial image, and from this point, this viewpoint, we can see what things really looked like in 1932 at the height of the gangster era. Ultimately, it's interesting to me. This is Goose Lake over here, completely dry. Now, this was absolutely the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl era. Things were getting a little bit desperate, but Goose Lake was completely dry. They were harvesting hay and doing all sorts of things on the lakeshore. And the plantation is sitting right here. Interestingly, this was still at the time period, this was before Wiper Avenue came through. So, well, this was Wiper Avenue. It's what they call Old Wiper Avenue now, but that came along this way. The new Wiper Avenue, if you will, comes along parallel to it as it does today, but actually continues on out this direction. And they filled in, the lake eventually had water again, as we all know, but they ended up actually filling in a portion of the edge of it to make room for the road for Wiper Avenue at the time. If you zoom in a little bit, you can see again the plantation and its site. Same era, same 1930s with the dry lake bed. This is actually the streetcar tracks, which were about to be taken out because the streetcar to White Bear ended in the fall of 1932. And again, the road coming through. This is the Cottage Park neighborhood back here behind the plantation. And if you look, the road that actually goes into Cottage Park here is visible a little bit. The plantation was incredibly close to that neighborhood. So I find it interesting. There are a lot of references to dance halls and things, complaints about dance halls and things in areas like Bald Eagle and out toward what is today Goose Lake and Gem Lake, I'm sorry, some of the other areas around town. But we don't see complaints about the plantation. And I don't know if that was because people were fearful to complain, or if they just there wasn't that much going on or what was happening. But you can see how close. And then this building is always intriguing with the big cupola there. That was the Cottage Park Clubhouse, or Cottage Park Association Clubhouse. And a portion of that house actually still stands back there on the corner, which is kind of fun as well. So interestingly, so 1930, 31, 32, things were going along fairly well, at least 1930, 31. And by 1933, you see here that they're talking about opening for the season, and many repairs and improvements are being made. They had more than 800 guests dine and dance for their opening evening. And at this point in 1933, the plantation was still under the management of Ben Harris. There were some updates and improvements, as you see. Apparently repairs were needed for the roof, the floor, and the ceiling. I don't know if they had water damage or what, but the ceiling actually ended up being, at that point, decorated as looking like a sky. And they decided to hang real southern moss from the trees and added air conditioning, if you can imagine, in 1933. By the end of that season, Harris closed the plantation, and he was reported as saying, in 1930 and 31, I did well, but the Depression hit everybody so hard they couldn't keep up their patronage. 1932 was bad, but 1933 was worse. What Harris didn't realize at the time is that 1934 was going to be even worse for him. By March of that year, he was wanted on a charge of operating a roulette wheel during his time at the plantation. He was indicted and found to be guilty and sentenced to 3 months in the workhouse. Interestingly, he ended up making a deal. You can kind of see a little bit, they refer to it over here with the Harris jail stay is so arranged to protect business. So when he left the plantation at the end of 1933, he went off and was working at another club. And then ultimately he was operating a liquor store and doing some other things because, of course, prohibition by this point is repealed and back in business. So interestingly, he made a deal. He had a 90-day sentence in the workhouse, and he made a deal with the judge and the district judge in Ramsey County to cut his sentence down to 30 days. So cut it down to a third of what it originally was, when he gave up the name of the man who actually operated the roulette wheel. Harris claimed that he only got 40% of the proceeds from the gambling, so he wasn't really the one doing the whole thing. So he really wasn't the guilty one, if you will. Whatever the case, it worked. And ultimately, interestingly, the article goes on, but it talks about afterwards, Harris and one of the deputy sheriffs went out to lunch. And then he had to get back to work and check on things because he had to make sure that his business stayed flush. So you never know. One of the other interesting stories about the plantation that just came to light, and this is what I love about the gangsters in general, but or the history, or our history in general, but the gangsters specifically, it tends to bring out lots of stories and lots of interesting side twists. So as we were promoting this program coming up, we got a message last week that ultimately the gentleman you see in the photograph here, Walter Pickler, was a bouncer at the plantation. He was supposed to have been a bouncer at the plantation. Now, we don't have employment records or other things necessarily to be able to verify that completely, but it sure, this photo sure helps at least place them there, because as you can see, that is the entrance to the plantation. Interestingly, the family story is that Walter was the bouncer, and Catherine, his wife, who you see with him, was a pianist at the club, and that's how they met. And they ended up being married in 1935, and one of those love stories for the ages. We don't have a lot of personal stories about the plantation. We hear people say, oh, my parents would go dancing there, or my grandparents would do this or that, or whatever. And one of the things that's always perplexed me a little bit about the whole thing is that people, over the years, people have reported that, there were guards at the door with Tommy guns, and there were, people all around watching and making sure that things were safe and whatnot. And it was very intimidating. And then other people will say, oh no, we would go hang out and, ride our bikes through the driveway and stuff. It was no big deal when we were kids. And, my parents were there every Saturday night and blah, blah, blah. Well, number one, as you've heard already, there have been different iterations, and we're not finished yet, but different iterations of the club as the years went on. It also occurred to us a number of years ago that it probably depended a lot on who was inside. Because if you had a John Dillinger or some of the higher level gangsters in the club itself, you probably had guards at the door. If you had just a regular old nightclub with dancing and other things, where things could get out of hand potentially, but in general, somewhat under control, you probably had somebody like Walter at the door and making sure that things were good. But he doesn't look like the Tommy gun wielding kind of fella, or who knows, maybe he was, but he certainly isn't in this particular photo. So I appreciate their granddaughter who shared the family story with us. And if you have stories out there, please let us know. It's always fun to make it a little more personal and a little more interesting as we go. And this is actually the other thing that I love about this. And if you've listened to me present before, you know that I'm always big on what's behind the main focus in the photo. So if you look at this is the closest picture we've ever had of this entryway of the plantation. It's kind of fun to be able to see. You can match it up with the drive slow signs and certainly the plantation sign up above, so we know we're in the right spot. But ultimately, and it almost looks, with the weeds and things growing, it almost looks to be just about the same time period. But anyway, kind of a fascinating piece to be able to get a little bit closer look at what it looks like under that portico. So 1930, the early 30s, 31, 32, 33 were really the heyday of the plantation for sure. things started to decline pretty rapidly after that. The Depression was in full swing, and Prohibition was repealed. So the power of the gangsters started to fade. Ultimately, by 1935, the Romeli family they had always owned it, but they were back managing, which is a little bit different for them. But the Romeli family was bringing in wholesome, is what they called it, different advertisements, but family-based entertainment, barn dances and things like that at a discounted rate. By 1936, in the upper right there, you see that the Plantation Night Club was offering free rent. You could go to the Romeli Boat Company in Wayzata and connect with them on it, but they would offer free rent. So if you had something you wanted to do there, go for it. And then by 1937, they were basically, it almost sounds desperate, Plantation Night Club, lease your own price. They really were trying to find things to really make it go. And it kind of sat empty like that. It was really the end of an era and a shift to a different era. So by 1941 and 42 in particular, the club sort of developed a different reputation. Here we see the Les Height Orchestra, who were going to be playing at the Plantation Night Club, or Plantation Club in White Bear. Interestingly, this is sourced out of the St. Paul Recorder in July of 1941. The St. Paul Recorder was a Black weekly newspaper for St. Paul. And so a lot of the ads, or a lot of the things that they promoted, were Black bands, jazz groups, different things. And interestingly, the city of St. Paul was not integrated at that point. We weren't as segregated as the South, but certainly it just wasn't a common thing to have Black bands as easily come in and out of different places. And so they didn't always have as many choices of where to go. So ultimately the Plantation was an option, and they would come out, a little bit further out of town, if you will. We weren't far, as you could tell, but a little bit further out of town, if you will, and be able to rent the plantation or do events at the plantation and have a large crowd. So interestingly, the St. Paul Recorder of this particular event reported that one of the most orderly and largest dance crowds of the year attended the Les Height dance at the Plantation Night Club in White Bear. This was another successful dance venture for promoter Levi Garrett. Among those seen cavorting around were Lee Harris of singing fame, dancing nearly all evening with that snappy dresser Hiawatha Peoples. Harriet Bird was enjoying herself dancing so much, and it goes on, and ultimately continued to draw attention and build an audience, build a following. The Recorder also highlighted that this would be, in their words, the first public dance the Twin Cities colored dancing public has ever had at the beautiful Plantation Nightclub. So it was a different outlet, or it served a different purpose for those early years of the 1940s. The Onyx Club, also out of the St. Paul Recorder, was another group that would rent out the club and have folks come out to White Bear to dance and enjoy, celebrate, hang out. And ultimately, this was an interesting offering they had for departing draftees for World War II. So they had a cabaret party at the plantation in their honor and to celebrate their draft. So by 1945, as World War II was coming to an end, you can see this aerial view from almost literally directly above the site. You can tell that physically not a lot had changed in the property or in the area so much. This was the road into Cottage Park here. This is actually still the Amundsen Boat Works over on this side. Goose Lake has a little bit of water, which was different from a decade or so before. And ultimately, everything else was fairly well the same. As the war ended in 1946, as the war had ended, three ex-veterans, bought the plantation, bought the property, and wanted to establish a summer theater. Interestingly, all three of them were University of Minnesota students, or had been from the University of Minnesota, and came together. They wanted a spot where they could offer plays, offer different things. So it became known as the Plantation Playhouse. And they opened on June 19th, 1946. They purchased the plantation, the former nightclub at White Bear, and presented a drama season of 10 plays, which started June 19th. The theater, as you can imagine, was run on a shoestring budget. But they put on quality shows. They had their programs and all sorts of things. And the theater itself, the space, it's sort of hard to envision, but the space actually could seat 400 people or so. And so they could bring in quite a few, sell quite a few tickets and bring in quite a good chunk. Ultimately, that only lasted, as far as we know, it lasted 3 seasons, 46, 47, and 48. So not incredibly long. And by 1950, the property was purchased by a man named Arthur Allen, who started to dismantle it that summer and then had it open the following spring as the Plantation Boat Livery and Drive-In. Interestingly, his goal was to have a building, a drive-in building that looked like the shape of a boat. Allen opened the following summer with boats from the neighboring Amundsen Boatworks, again, just over on the end here, that he could let out as part of his boat livery. He would rent those, and then a menu where every bite is a delight. So I don't entirely get the shape of the boat thing coming from the building, but maybe if we were down on the ground, it's hard to say. Ultimately, that site today is actually the site of Lions Park. And in 1974, the city purchased the property with the intention that the building had been left, unfortunately, not in great shape and wasn't doing all that well. And so ultimately needed to be demolished. And so that is how Lions Park actually came to be in that particular spot. You can see here, this is actually roughly about where the driveway or the entrance to the plantation would have been. And the parking lot and building space is actually right along the side there, off to the side, but you can see the view they had. I mean, it was a wonderful setting, a wonderful spot to be near the lake. And during those years, all of those many years, the Romelis knew what they were doing when it came to hospitality, from the catering to the pavilion to the plantation and the nightclub offerings. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for being here. And we look forward to seeing you again next time. Take care.